Well, thank you very much to Christian Simonetti for inviting me to participate. I'm very excited to be part of the symposium. The title of my talk today is The Botanical Afterlives of Concrete. Walking along the banks of the River Spree, crossing Berlin's so-called Museum Island, you have a good chance of making a surprise botanical encounter. It is here in the middle of the new city of Berlin, amidst government buildings and construction sites, that you can find a small yellow flowering plant that has a peculiar history. This plant is called sticky goosefoot or Chenopodium botrytis. Covered with sticky glandular hairs, the plant grows between 10 to 80 centimeters high. It has a strong aromatic scent and can be used for flavoring and cooking. Preferring a Mediterranean climate, sticky goosefoot usually grows in so-called ruderal spaces, on sandy and stony soils at the site of river walks or river banks, roads and train tracks, in the cracks of sidewalks, on ruins, as well as on rubbish or waste. In the 16th century, the plant was imported from Constantinople and cultivated in gardens throughout Europe, mainly for use in controlling moss and for medicinal purposes. In the course of industrialization and urbanization in the 19th century, as ruderal spaces and their gravelly and sandy soils proliferated with the expansion of transport routes in and between many urban centers, sticky goosefoot spread beyond cultivated areas in many warmer regions in Europe, Eurasia, and also the Middle East. In contrast, north of the Alps, the plant was only able to grow sporadically due to the colder climate. Curiously, sticky goosefoot has prospered in chilly Berlin. In the years after World War II, when Berlin had been heavily bombed and large rubble spaces dotted the city for decades, the blasted landscapes of the war provided a habitat for sticky goosefoot and other non-native plants to flourish and become part of the permanent flora of Berlin. This proliferation posed a riddle to West Berlin botanists and prompted them, surrounded by the Berlin Wall and cut off from the countryside, to study plant migration and the ecology of ruderal plants in the city. Now, the term ruderal comes from the Latin word rudus, which is the term for rubble. A common botanic term, it refers to plants that grow spontaneously in so-called disturbed landscapes that are usually considered hostile to life. In the cracks of sidewalks, alongside train tracks and roads, industrial sites, waste disposal areas, or rubble fields. Generally, the disturbance may be natural from wildfires or avalanches, but in most cases, it is a consequence of human activity, such as construction, mining, building of roads or agriculture, irrigation, or abandoned fields. Often, ruderals gradually lose their competition over other native species, but in extreme situations when, for example, the natural topsoil is covered with a foreign human substance, such as concrete, ruderals may be able to establish themselves over native species. Ruderals are characterized by massive seed production. They grow independently of mycorrhizae and are thus only symbiotic with rubble and anthropogenic human-made landscapes. Neither wild nor domesticated, ruderal communities depend on an edge effect and the juxtaposition of contrasting environments in one ecosystem. The emergence of ruderal plants as a scientific object of study triggered the proliferation of the field of urban ecology and impacted environmental policies in the city of Berlin for years to come. Yet despite this significance, in this talk I'd like to offer the history of the war's blasted rubble landscapes and their botanical afterlives, to consider its analytical possibilities for the study of cities and for cultural analysis more generally. Doing so, I will also introduce the notion of rural city that I develop in my forthcoming book, A View of the City, in which nature is not out there to be managed, controlled, incorporated into anthropogenic urban landscapes via technology and urban infrastructure, but an integral and unwieldy part of the city. A rural city in which humans and non-humans have coexisted, however violently, all along. Revisiting the history of botanical research on rural plants, I reflect on the challenges that the notion of rural city poses to the study of built environments, their solidified structures of concrete, and their unruly elements, which always also include plants and soil that is often poor in nutrients. But also, on a more general level, I'd like to reflect on what a rural analytic might contribute to a cultural analysis that examines what it means to live on an increasingly inhospitable planet, haunted not only by environmental destruction, but also by the proliferation of nationalism, racism, and economic precarities. Okay, so my first section is called A City of Rubble. At the end of World War II, the city of Berlin lay in rubble. In their effort to bring the Nazi regime to a final halt, the Western Allies, applying a technology that Germans had utilized earlier, bombed large parts of the city center. As is well known, thousands of people died during the bombings on all sides of the war, and in the end, almost 50% of the built environment in the city center was destroyed. The city's infrastructures, including the train system, the pavement of roads, electricity networks, and the sewage system, had torn apart. Trees and parks burnt down during the bombings. The remaining ones were later cut down for use as firewood. Amid the destruction, images of Berlin as feral city abound. News of starving deer, wolves, and wild boar ravaging the city's outskirts in herds evoked a sense of Berlin gone wild. And with it, another wild sentiment unfolded: numbness. In his book, A Natural History of Destruction, W.G. Sebald depicts this numbness as a key element of the ecology of the bombed cities after fascism. He describes scenes of apathy and anesthesia amid a population living in ruins. People walking through the streets as if nothing had happened, and the city had always looked like that. Amid the apathy, there was a sense of unhomeliness. Playing in the weedy ruins of war as a child, Sebald remembers that one never felt at ease, fearing one might bump into the body of an animal or a human corpse. In this context of urban breakdown, cultivating plants played an important role in reconstructing the city. Short of food, residents grew vegetables in the burnt and locked down forests and parks. In the late 1940s, West Berlin's mayor declared the bombings of the city's major park, the Tiergarten, or Animal Garden, the largest scar inflicted on the city, and made its reforestation a top priority. Thousands of oak and birch trees were donated from across the country via plane during the Berlin airlift. At the same time, in an effort to erase the war's traces, a new infrastructure of nature built on the rubble of concrete structures emerged as the city was rebuilt. Large amounts of rubble were recycled to rebuild roads or landscaped into hills and integrated into the city's natural landscape. Today, Berlin has more than a dozen of these rubble hills. In German, they're called Trümmerberge. And the so-called Teufelsberg, Devil's Mountain, is the highest of all of them. It's 100 meters high. The notion of new life emerging from ruins became a key element in the national imaginary after the war. The term rising from ruins was the title of the East German national anthem from 1949 on. And in the 1950s, West Germany depicted the following image on its 50-cent coin. A woman planting an oak seedling, commemorating not only the much celebrated rubble women, but also women reforesting the lockdown forests. Rural city. Yet despite the carefully managed nature returning to the city, the rubble had its own life. Due to Berlin's political division during the Cold War, the rubble fields still dotted the city center for decades. These blasted landscapes provided a habitat for plants to flourish in the city for the very first time. Intrigued by this new diversity, West Berlin botanists, both hobbyists and trained ecologists, began to study the rubble vegetation and developed a different way of seeing nature in the city. One of the ecologists was Herbert Zukop, whom I have been in conversation with since 2008. Cut off from their usual field sites in their countryside because of the city's division, he and other botanists discovered a city bustling with plants from all over the world. These aliens or non-native species, usually considered weeds, were from warmer regions in the Mediterranean, Asia, and the Americas. Among them, sticky goosefoot, Chenopodium botrys, but also a tree of heaven, a tree from China, the North American tree black locust, and the herb giant goldenrod. These plants were ruderal plants. They prefer dry, gravelly soils and are usually the first to colonize disturbed environments, such as the sides of roads, train tracks, urban wastelands, or rubble. Their seeds had found their way into the city via diverse transport routes. Some of them had crossed the city on the boots of refugees or soldiers during the war, or arrived via packaging material from imported goods, or via hay transported on wagons by the Russian army. Other seeds' routes remained unknown. It was sticky goosefoot that attracted the botanist's attention. Intrigued by its first pervasive debut in Northern Europe, the botanists studied its ecology in detail, examining its dispersal, tissue production, the effects of light on its growth, its water regimes, habitats, and associations, and the successional dynamic of the ruderal vegetation it was part of. Following ruderals, like sticky goosefoot, a world of cosmopolitan connection and profound environmental change unfolded in front of the botanist's eyes. The bombed city revealed a secret. Increasing trade, migration, urbanization, and climate change had created a diversification of habitats, and a new type of vegetation became visible. An urban vegetation spontaneously growing on disturbed grounds. The first to inhabit disturbed lands, ruderals were not a nuisance. They set the stage for other flourishing ecosystems. For example, by giving rise to spontaneous wetlands, attracting birds, or providing shade and organic matter important for other species. Yet ruderals were not simply a sign of regenerating nature, but the outcome of a much more ambivalent and in fact sticky and radically changing urban ecology, amid blasted landscapes of war and ecological disturbance. It turned out that the distribution patterns of plants like sticky goosefoot or tree of heaven gave clues about different temperature zones across the city. By tracking ruderal plants' life cycles, their different starting points, and phases of budding, leafing, flowering, and fruiting, the botanists could determine different temperature regimes throughout the city, with flowering phases sometimes starting more than a week earlier in the city center than at its edges. This greenhouse effect was an effect of both urban infrastructure. It was due to increasing traffic, densely built environments, additional heat sources by power stations or heated buildings and cities. But it was also an effect of rising temperatures on Earth. Ruderals were thus not only indicators of a city coming back to life, they were also a warning sign of what we may today call the life-altering forces of the Anthropocene, including global environmental change and the destruction that Western nationalism and racism had wrought across the world. In his book, Greening Berlin, historian of science Jens Lachmund has shown how West Berlin botanical research ultimately led to shifts in environmental policies that in some cases led to the protection of urban wastelands, such as the Schöneberger Südgelände, which is an abandoned train station that was turned into a nature park in Berlin. But Lachmund also argues that the practice of urban ecology in Berlin became a seedbed for new nature regimes, specifically biotope protection, that created new hierarchies of value of different urban habitats. Yet despite this incorporation into urban governance and bureaucratic regulation, I argue that the encounter between botanists and ruderal plants like sticky goosefoot created actually an opening for the study of cities and the ecologies that emerge amid its disturbed environments. First of all, I argue that the post-war research on rubble plants enabled a view that diverged from imaginaries of the city as a space of culture, cultivated nature, and the nation as homogeneous entity. This stood in stark contrast to post-war urban planning and the native natures the fascist regime had dreamt of. Rurals challenged these notions of pristine nature and the assumed connection between soil and Germanness, as well as Nazi efforts to reactivate the nation and the German folk by reconciling nature and technology via landscapes of concrete such as the Autobahn. Instead, it directed attention to the unintended disintegration of modern systems of order and the rubble's ecologies, and thus the often unnoticed cosmopolitan and precarious ways of remaking the urban fabric. Neither wild nor domesticated, rurals dwell in the gaps of urban concrete, and they're the invisible hitchhikers of urban infrastructure. Emerging by chance, you don't know exactly where to find them. As artist Louis Weinberger puts it, they require a form of precise inattention. If you're lucky, you catch a quick glance of them as you walk along the road or take a train trip. Secondly, sticky goosefoot and its ruderal companions require that we think across different registers and scales of migration, racial violence, global climate change, and the degradation of environments in the context of war and the destructive effects of capitalist profitability. Thinking across these registers might help work against what Kim Fortune has recently called the Latour effect in contemporary anthropology, in science and technology studies, and strands of the environmental humanities. A singular focus on practices of expertise and actor networks in late industrialism that does not take a closer look at the material and social constitution of the deeply toxic and inhospitable environments that make up our lives today. So, a few concluding thoughts. Studying cities, much recent anthropological attention has focused on urban infrastructure and the materiality of built environments. What's exciting about this emerging scholarship is that it offers an opportunity to think about the intersections of materiality and social life. And if concrete, as Adrienne Forti has pointed out, is caught up in the confusions and contradictions that constitute our ideas of nature, then what emerges when we ask about what happens when the concrete structures and ground of cities literally burst apart or fall into ruin, exposing not exposing original pristine soil, but deeply disturbed matter. Consider the word infrastructure, the underlying material structures that make human social organization possible, the built arteries of a city, growing, proliferating, or in states of dereliction. The word's etymology of the word infrastructure reveals its appearance within U.S. Cold War culture. The term came to prominence in U.S. and French military settings after the formation of NATO in the 1940s, and was subsequently adopted by urban planners in its civilian sense in relation to the ruins of Keynesian infrastructure in the 1970s. Yet more importantly, the word infrastructure is also a combination of the Latin prefix infra, which means below, and structure. Originally imported from French, infra also refers to subgrade, the native material underneath a constructed pavement, railway, or road. The distinction between what is below and above, between native and foreign, between matter and symbol, or base and superstructure, makes little sense when one considers the story of sticky goosefoot. Rural ecologies are not the native stuff underneath, but the multi-species animate worlds that grow alongside human-made structures and concrete surfaces that have burst apart. They are an alternative infrastructure, not for humans but for plants, rooted in soil that is dry and poor in nutrients. Although not immediately accessible to the logic of capital, they are not immune to becoming part of a profitable urban aesthetic. Seen from this perspective, Sticky Goosefoot's story is less about margins than about the multi-layered, haunted ways of being that make up urban lives, and also the afterlives of concrete today. The French title of Lévi-Strauss' book, The Savage Mind, was La Pensée Sauvage, which has a double meaning: wild savage thought, but also wild pansies. Indeed, the French cover featured an image of a wild pansy, Viola tricolore, a wild, uncultivated sister of the more decorative garden variety Viola vitrociniana. For the English translation, Lévi-Strauss suggested the title Wild Pansies for Thinking. For him, wild pansies, pensée sauvage, pointed to the fact that, like wildflowers, thinking grows in certain life conditions. Pensée sauvage thus does not signify the thought of primitives or savages, but rather a form of wild and undomesticated thinking, a science of the concrete that, unlike pensée, thinking crosses myth, matter, and science, and has not been cultivated to produce output. Perhaps today, as thought too often gets reduced to output, and as we wade through the rubble of increasing extinctions and contemporary forms of racial violence, global climate change, and the loss of hospitable environments for both humans and non-humans, the slogan should be Sticky Goosefoot for Thinking. Thank you.